I'm Megan Carter, 29 and 6 months pregnant when my world collapsed. One moment I was planning nursery colors with my husband David. The next I was standing at his graveside, devastated by a sudden heart attack that took him at just 34. But grief was only the beginning. 3 weeks later, I discovered that Marcus, David's trusted business partner and our daughter's godfather, had systematically emptied our construction company's accounts, leaving me with nothing but debt and a baby on the way. What I uncovered about their partnership, and the lengths I went to reclaim my child's future, would expose secrets that shattered everything I thought I knew about the two most important men in my life. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted completely, like this video. David and I were high school sweethearts in a way that made people roll their eyes, the kind of love story that seemed too perfect to be real. We met when I was 16, and he was 17, both of us working part-time jobs at the local hardware store. He was already talking about starting his own construction company someday, sketching building plans on napkins during our lunch breaks. I was studying business administration, dreaming of the day I could help him turn those napkin sketches into reality. By the time we graduated college, David had already landed his first major contract renovating the old elementary school. Marcus Hoffman joined the business shortly after, a smooth-talking guy with connections and an MBA who promised to handle the financial side while David focused on the actual construction work. They formed Carter and Hoffman Construction, and for 8 years it seemed like the perfect partnership. Our life felt like something out of a magazine. We bought our dream house, a craftsman-style home that David had renovated himself, complete with the wraparound porch I'd always wanted, and a workshop in the back where he'd spend hours perfecting his woodworking skills. The ultrasound photo from our 20-week appointment sat framed on his workbench, right next to his coffee mug and measuring tape. He'd talk to my belly every morning before work, telling our daughter about the treehouse he was planning to build for her. The morning he died started like any other. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping decaf coffee and reading pregnancy books while David made his usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. He kissed my forehead and rubbed my belly, whispering his daily promise to our daughter that he'd be home for dinner. The last thing he said to me was, "I love you both more than yesterday, less than tomorrow." It was his favorite saying, one he'd borrowed from his grandmother. The heart attack happened at the job site around noon. Marcus called me, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what the paramedics had told him. David was only 34, with no history of heart problems. The doctors said it was a massive attack, nothing anyone could have done. He was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital. I remember standing in that hospital corridor, one hand on my belly and the other clutching the ultrasound photo Marcus had grabbed from David's truck. The image of our daughter, due in 3 months, felt like the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. David would never see her first smile, never teach her to ride a bike, never walk her down the aisle someday. In that moment, I thought losing him was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I had no idea how wrong I was. The funeral was a blur of black clothing and sympathetic faces. David's family flew in from Oregon, and our small town seemed to empty itself into the church. He'd touched so many lives, former clients whose homes he'd built, subcontractors who'd worked with him for years, neighbors whose kids he'd helped with school projects. The stack of sympathy cards on our kitchen counter grew taller each day, each one a reminder of the hole his absence had left. Marcus delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke about David's integrity, his craftsmanship, and his excitement about becoming a father. He called David his brother, his best friend, the most honest man he'd ever known. Standing at the podium in his perfectly pressed suit, Marcus looked like a man genuinely devastated by loss. The tears in his eyes seemed real, and when he promised to take care of David's family, I believed him completely. "David made me promise years ago," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "that if anything ever happened to him, I'd look after Megan and the baby. He trusted me with his business, and now he's trusting me with his family's future. I won't let him down." The congregation murmured their approval, and I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. At least David had thought ahead. At least he'd made sure we'd be taking care of Dot after the service. Marcus was everywhere, directing the pallbearers, organizing the reception, fielding calls from clients and vendors. He told me not to worry about anything business-related, that he'd handle all the contracts and financial obligations. "You just focus on staying healthy for the baby," he said, squeezing my hand. "David would want you to rest." My mother-in-law, Patricia, pulled me aside during the reception. "That Marcus is such a good man," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "David always said he was like a brother to him. You're lucky to have him looking out for you." Even my own parents, who'd driven down from Portland, were impressed by Marcus's devotion. "Not many business partners would step up like that," my father said. "You can tell he really cared about David." But there were moments, fleeting ones, that I dismissed as grief-induced paranoia when something felt off. When Marcus was on his phone during the reception, speaking in hushed tones and glancing around nervously. When he quickly closed his laptop as I approached to thank him for handling the business calls. When he suggested, almost too casually, that I should consider selling the house and moving somewhere smaller, somewhere that wouldn't remind me of David. "The property taxes alone must be killing you," he said, his hand on my shoulder in what felt like a possessive gesture. "David always worried about leaving you with too much overhead." I shook my head, confused. "David never mentioned property taxes being a problem. We refinanced 2 years ago at a great rate." Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Oh, right. Of course, I just meant, well, with the baby coming and all, you might want to simplify your life, less to worry about." Later that evening, as I sat in our bedroom surrounded by sympathy cards and thank you notes I needed to write, I found myself thinking about that conversation. David had been proud of our house, proud of the work he'd put into it. He'd spent weekends reinforcing the foundation, updating the electrical system, installing new hardwood floors. Why would he worry about us being able to afford it? I opened the card from Marcus again, reading his handwritten note. "Megan, I promise to take care of everything. David trusted me with his business, and now I'll make sure you and the baby never want for anything. You're family to me." Marcus, the words should have been comforting, but something about them made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he'd written. David trusted me with his business, instead of, David and I built this business together. Maybe it was the way he'd inserted himself into our family, as if David's death had somehow made him our protector by default. I placed the card back on the stack and tried to push the doubts away. Grief was making me paranoid, reading meaning into innocent gestures. Marcus was trying to help, just like he'd promised. David had trusted him completely, and I needed to do the same. But deep down, a small voice whispered that something wasn't right. I just didn't know how wrong I was about everything. 3 weeks after the funeral, reality began to set in. The casseroles from well-meaning neighbors had been eaten or frozen. The flowers had wilted, and the house felt impossibly quiet. I was 6.5 months pregnant, and the practical matters of widowhood could no longer be postponed. I needed to understand our financial situation, to know what David had left for me and the baby. We'd always kept separate checking accounts, but shared a savings account and the business accounts. David had handled most of the business banking, but I'd been listed as a co-signer on everything. At least, I thought I had been. The first sign of trouble came when I tried to access our business checking account online. The password David had given me no longer worked. I called the bank, explaining my situation to a sympathetic representative, who put me on hold for what felt like forever. "Mrs. Carter," she said when she returned, "I show that you were removed as a co-signer on this account 6 months ago. The only authorized user is Marcus Hoffman." My heart stopped. "That's impossible. I never authorized that. My husband never mentioned anything about changing the account." I'm sorry, but according to our records, the change was made with proper documentation. You'd need to speak with Mr. Hoffman about getting reauthorized. I hung up, my hands shaking. There had to be a mistake. David wouldn't have removed me from the business accounts without telling me. We talked about making sure I could access everything if something happened to him, especially with the baby coming. I called Marcus immediately. He answered on the first ring, his voice warm and concerned. Megan, how are you holding up? I was just thinking about you. Marcus, I tried to access the business account, and the bank says I'm not authorized anymore. They said I was removed 6 months ago. There was a pause, just long enough to make me uncomfortable. Oh, that. Yeah. David asked me to handle that. When we were restructuring some of the accounts for tax purposes, you know how complicated business banking can be. He didn't want you to have to worry about all that paperwork. But he didn't tell me anything about being removed from the accounts. I'm sure he meant to, but you know how he was always trying to protect you from the boring business stuff. Listen, don't worry about it. I've got everything under control. The important thing is that you and the baby are taken care of. Something in his tone made me press harder. I'd like to see the account statements, Marcus. I need to understand what our financial situation is. Another pause. Of course, absolutely. I'll get those together for you. Things have been a little chaotic since David passed, but I'll have everything organized by the end of the week. After I hung up, I sat in David's home office, staring at the locked filing cabinet beside his desk. David had always been meticulous about record keeping, filing away every receipt, every contract, every bank statement. If there were answers to be found, they'd be in that cabinet. I spent the next hour searching for the key, going through every drawer in the desk, every box in the closet, every container on the shelves. Finally, I found it taped to the underside of the desk drawer, such a David thing to do. Hiding something in plain sight. The first thing I found was a manila folder labeled Banking Personal. Inside were our personal account statements going back 2 years, everything filed chronologically. Our savings account showed steady deposits from both the business and David's personal account. Nothing unusual there. But then I found another folder, Banking Business Concerns. The label was in David's handwriting, but the word concerns was written in a different pen, as if it had been added later. Inside were business bank statements from the past 8 months, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Large withdrawals, sometimes several in a single week. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. The business account that should have had nearly $200,000 in it was down to less than $30. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. Some of the withdrawals were accompanied by deposit slips, but the handwriting on the signatures looked wrong. I pulled out a personal check David had written to our landscaper just a month before he died, comparing the signature. The writing was similar, but not quite right. The loops were different, the pressure uneven. I reached for my phone to call Marcus, then stopped. The conversation we just had replayed in my mind. His 2 quick explanations, his insistence that David had wanted to protect me from the boring business stuff, his promise to get me the statements by the end of the week. David had never hidden business matters from me. He'd always said that if something happened to him, I needed to know, enough to protect myself and the baby. He'd spent hours teaching me about the different types of accounts, the seasonal cash flow patterns, the way construction payments worked. So why would he suddenly decide to remove me from the business accounts without telling me? And why would he be concerned enough about the banking situation to create a special folder labeled Concerns? I felt the baby kick, a sharp reminder of what was at stake. Whatever was happening here, I needed to figure it out quickly. David's daughter deserved to inherit the business he'd built, not the remnants of whatever Marcus was doing to it. I locked the filing cabinet and hid the key in my jewelry box. If Marcus asked about the files, I'd need to be careful about what I revealed. Something told me that the man who delivered such a beautiful eulogy, who'd promised to take care of us, might not be the friend I thought he was. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was 6 months pregnant, completely alone, And the person David had trusted most in the world might be stealing from us. I had never felt more vulnerable in my life. Spent the next 3 days going through every document in David's filing cabinet, piece by piece. What I found painted a picture that made me sick to my stomach. The suspicious withdrawals from the business account weren't random. They followed a pattern. Large amounts were being moved out every 2 weeks, always on Fridays, always to an account labeled H&S Consulting Services. I'd never heard of H&S Consulting, and David had never mentioned hiring outside consultants. We'd always handled everything in-house, from project management to accounting. David was proud of keeping overhead low and profits high, but the most damning evidence was in a folder labeled Signature Samples. Inside were practice sheets, pages and pages of someone trying to replicate David's signature. Some attempts were closer than others, but they all had the same telltale signs: too much pressure on the pen, loops that were slightly too wide, and a hesitancy in the stroke that David's natural signature never had. At the bottom of the folder was a photocopy of a check made out to H&S Consulting for $45,000, dated just 2 weeks before David died. The signature was a near-perfect forgery, but I could see where the forger had gone over certain letters twice, trying to make them look more natural. My hands shook as I held the evidence. Marcus hadn't just been stealing from the business. He'd been practicing David's signature, preparing to continue the theft even after David was gone. The thought made me nauseous. I called my college roommate, Lisa, who'd gone to law school and now worked as a paralegal in Portland. I needed advice, but I also needed someone I could trust completely. "Megan, slow down," Lisa said when I called her, crying and trying to explain what I'd found. "You're saying you think Marcus has been forging David's signature?" "I'm not thinking it, Lisa. I know it. I have pages of practice signatures and bank statements showing money being moved to some consulting company that doesn't exist." Okay. First thing, don't confront him yet. If he's been doing this for months, he's probably got a plan for dealing with questions. You need to document everything before you make any moves. What kind of documentation? Photos of everything. Bank statements, the practice signatures, anything that shows a pattern of fraud. And you need to figure out what this H&S Consulting company is. My guess is it's a shell company he set up to funnel money to himself. I spent the rest of the day photographing every document, uploading them to a secure cloud storage account that Marcus couldn't access. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer the picture became. Marcus had been systematically stealing from Carter and Hoffman Construction for at least 8 months, possibly longer. That the timeline bothered me. Why had he started stealing so recently? David and Marcus had been partners for 8 years. If Marcus was going to steal from the business, why wait until now? The answer came in another folder I found tucked behind the others. Personal M. Hoffman. Inside were printed emails between David and Marcus, dating back about a year. The tone started friendly but grew increasingly tense. The first email was David asking Marcus about some discrepancies in the quarterly reports. Marcus's response was casual, dismissive, just some accounting adjustments that would be corrected in the next quarter. But David wasn't satisfied. Email after email showed him pressing for more detailed explanations, asking for documentation, requesting meetings to go over the books together. Marcus's responses became more evasive, more defensive. The final email in the folder was dated just 1 week before David died. It was from David to Marcus, and the subject line was simply, "We need to talk. Marcus, I've been going through the accounts, and I need you to explain some things. The transfers to H&S Consulting aren't adding up, and I can't find any contracts or invoices to support them. I've also noticed some irregularities in the signature authorizations on the business account. I'd like to meet tomorrow morning to discuss this before it goes any further. I'm hoping there's a simple explanation, but I need to understand what's happening with our finances." David Marcus's response was short and cold. "I'll be there at 8 a.m. We'll sort this out." I stared at the email, my heart pounding. David had discovered the theft. He'd confronted Marcus about it, and they'd planned to meet the morning after David sent that email. But David had died of a heart attack that very night, before the meeting could take place. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. David discovers that his business partner has been stealing from him, confronts him about it, and dies of a massive heart attack that same night. At 34 years old, with no history of heart problems, my mind raced with possibilities I didn't want to consider. Could Marcus have done something to cause David's heart attack? Could he have threatened David, stressed him to the point where his heart gave out? I was probably overthinking it. Heart attacks could happen to anyone, even healthy young men. The stress of discovering his partner's betrayal could have been enough to trigger it naturally, but the doubt was there now, growing like a tumor in my chest. Marcus had been at the job site when David collapsed. He'd been the one to call 911, the one to ride with David to the hospital. If he'd done something to cause the heart attack, he'd have been in the perfect position to play the devastated friend and business partner. Needed to know more about H&S Consulting. I needed to understand exactly how much money Marcus had stolen, and whether David's death had been as natural as everyone believed. But first, I needed to be very careful about how I proceeded. If Marcus was capable of theft on this scale, if he'd been willing to forge David's signature and steal from a pregnant widow, what else might he be capable of? I placed all the documents back in the filing cabinet exactly as I'd found them, then locked it and hid the key. Tomorrow I'd start making calls, doing research, building a case. David had been trying to protect our family's future when he discovered the theft. Now it was my turn to finish what he'd started. Our daughter deserved justice, and I was going to make sure she got it. I spent 2 sleepless nights planning exactly what I would say to Marcus. I couldn't let him know how much I'd discovered not yet. I needed to see how he'd react to direct questions, whether he'd try to lie his way out of it or come clean. On Friday morning, I called him and asked if he could come over to discuss the business accounts. My voice was steady, even though my heart was racing. "Of course," he said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I've been meaning to get those statements organized for you anyway. How about I come by around 2? Before he arrived, I set up my phone to record our conversation. Lisa had warned me that any evidence I gathered needed to be documented if I hoped to build a legal case. I placed the small digital recorder on the bookshelf behind where Marcus would be sitting, hidden behind a picture frame. Marcus arrived precisely at 2, carrying a manila folder and wearing his usual friendly smile. He hugged me carefully, mindful of my pregnant belly, and asked how I was feeling. "I'm managing," I said, leading him to the living room. "But I really need to understand our financial situation. The baby's due in less than 3 months, and I need to know what we're working with." "Absolutely. David would want you to feel secure." He opened the folder and pulled out several bank statements. "Here are the business account statements for the past 6 months. As you can see, the business is doing well. We've got about 30,000 in checking, and the receivables look good." I glanced at the statements he'd given me. They were real bank statements, but they only showed the final balances, not the individual transactions. None of the suspicious withdrawals were visible. "These don't show the individual transactions," I said carefully. "I'd like to see the detailed statements, the ones that show where the money is going." Marcus's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Oh, those are a mess right now. You know how David was he'd write checks for materials and subcontractors, and sometimes forget to note what they were for. I'm still sorting through all the receipts and invoices to make sense of it all." "I see." I took a breath. "Marcus, I need to ask you something directly. Have there been any unusual expenses lately? Any large payments that I should know about?" "Unusual? How?" His tone was still friendly, but I could see tension in his shoulders. "Well, I noticed that you mentioned removing me from the business account 6 months ago. Around the same time, it looks like some large payments were being made to consulting companies. I'm just trying to understand what those were for." The change in Marcus's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His smile became forced, and he leaned back in his chair. "Megan, I know this is all very overwhelming for you, especially with the pregnancy and everything you've been through. Maybe it would be better if I just handle all the business details for now. David always said you shouldn't have to worry about the complicated financial stuff. David never said that to me, I replied, keeping my voice level. In fact, he always insisted that I understand the business finances, especially after we found out about the baby. Marcus's jaw tightened. Look, the construction business is complicated. There are seasonal cash flows, escrow accounts, retention payments. It's not something you can just jump into without experience. I've been handling these things for 8 years. I'm not trying to take over the business, Marcus. I just want to understand what David left for me and our daughter. And I'm telling you that you don't need to worry about it. The business is profitable. You own 50% of it. And I'll make sure you get your share of everything. The way he said, "your share," made my skin crawl, as if he were doing me a favor by giving me what was legally mine. What about H&S Consulting? I asked, watching his face carefully. Marcus went very still. For a moment, the mask of friendly concern slipped completely, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. Where did you hear about H&S Consulting? His voice was quiet, almost dangerous. It came up in some of the bank records I was reviewing. You shouldn't be going through business records without me there to explain them, he said, his tone shifting from friendly to authoritative. That's exactly the kind of thing that can cause confusion and misunderstandings. Then explain it to me now. What is H&S Consulting, and why has the business been paying them? Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. When he turned back to me, his expression was serious. Megan, I think you're getting worked up over nothing. Pregnancy hormones can make everything seem more stressful than it really is. Maybe you should focus on preparing for the baby and let me handle the business side of things. The condescension in his voice made my anger flare, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'm not getting worked up, Marcus. I'm asking legitimate questions about my family's financial situation. And I'm telling you that everything is under control. David trusted me to take care of you and the baby. And that's exactly what I'm doing, by removing me from the business accounts without telling me, by protecting you from unnecessary stress during a difficult pregnancy. His voice had risen, and I could see the real Marcus emerging, the one who'd been hiding behind the mask of the grieving friend. This was a man who was used to being in control, who didn't like being questioned. I think you should leave, I said quietly. Marcus stared at me for a long moment. Then his expression softened again, the friendly mask sliding back into place. Megan, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to raise my voice. I know you're scared and confused, and I should be more patient with you. Please just go. He gathered up the bank statements and folder. I'll get you more detailed information next week, okay? And maybe we should set up a meeting with the accountant so he can explain everything properly. After he left, I sat in the living room for a long time, my hand on my belly, feeling the baby's movements. The recording device had captured everything, including the moment when Marcus's carefully constructed facade had cracked up. He hadn't denied the existence of H&S Consulting. He hadn't explained the large withdrawals. And most telling of all, he'd tried to gaslight me, suggesting that my concerns were just pregnancy, hormones and stress. David had trusted this man with his business and his family's future. But the man who'd just left my house wasn't the loyal friend and partner everyone believed him to be. He was a predator who'd been systematically stealing from us, and now that David was gone, he thought he could manipulate and intimidate me into silence. He was wrong. After Marcus left, I felt a desperate need to find more evidence. My confrontation with him had confirmed my suspicions, but I needed concrete proof if I was going to take legal action. I returned to David's office, this time examining every inch of the space more carefully. David had been methodical about everything. His tools were organized by size and function. His project files were color-coded and alphabetized. His desk drawers contained labeled organizers for every type of supply. If he'd been investigating Marcus's theft, he would have hidden the evidence somewhere safe but accessible. I ran my hands along the underside of every drawer, checked behind every picture frame, even pulled books off the shelves to see if anything was hidden behind them. Finally, I found what I was looking for, taped to the very back of the bottom desk drawer. In a spot that would be invisible unless you completely removed the drawer was a small USB drive. My hands trembled as I peeled away the tape and plugged the drive into David's computer. The USB contained a single folder labeled MH Investigation, Marcus Hoffman Investigation. Inside were dozens of files, bank records, photographs of documents, email printouts, and a detailed timeline that made my blood run cold. David's investigation had been thorough and methodical. He'd started noticing discrepancies about 10 months ago, small amounts at first, easy to overlook or explain away. But over time, the thefts had grown bolder and more frequent. The most damning file was a spreadsheet David had created, tracking every suspicious transaction. He'd managed to trace the money from the business account to H&S Consulting, then from H&S Consulting to a personal account belonging to Marcus Hoffman. The total amount stolen was staggering, $847,000 over 18 months. But Marcus hadn't just been stealing cash. He'd also been using the business credit lines to make personal purchases, charging everything from gambling debts to luxury vacations to Carter and Hoffman construction. He'd even taken out a loan against the business's equipment, using forged documents with David's signature. One folder contained photographs David had taken secretly Marcus at the Riverside Casino, Marcus signing papers at a luxury car dealership, Marcus at expensive restaurants with a woman I didn't recognize. The timestamps showed these photos had been taken during business hours, when Marcus was supposed to be working on job sites. The most heartbreaking file was David's personal notes, written in his careful handwriting. "I don't want to believe this about Marcus. He's been like a brother to me for 8 years. But the evidence is overwhelming. He's not just stealing money, he's stealing from my daughter's future, from Megan's security. I have to confront him, but I'm scared about what this will do to the business, to our friendship, to everything we've built together." Another note, dated just 3 days before David died. "Marcus is getting sloppy. The forged signatures are getting easier to spot, and he's moving larger amounts more frequently. I think he knows I'm onto him." I tried to ask casual questions about the H&S payments yesterday, and he got defensive immediately. "I need to document everything before I confront him directly. If something happens to me, Megan needs to know the truth." The final note was dated the day before David's heart attack. "I've gathered enough evidence to prove what Marcus has been doing. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to give him a chance to come clean and return the money. If he refuses, I'll have no choice but to go to the police. I pray it doesn't come to that, but I can't let him continue stealing from my family." I sat back in David's chair, tears streaming down my face. My husband had spent the last months of his life discovering that his best friend and business partner was betraying him. The stress must have been enormous, the pressure of trying to save the business while protecting our family's future. But there was more on the USB drive. David had been meticulous about documenting Marcus's patterns, including his gambling addiction. According to David's research, Marcus owed significant amounts to several casinos and had been using the stolen money to pay down his debts. But instead of getting clean, he'd just gotten deeper into gambling, creating a cycle that required more and more theft to sustain. The timeline showed that Marcus's stealing had accelerated dramatically after David and I announced our pregnancy. It was as if knowing that David would soon have more expenses and more reason to scrutinize. The finances had made Marcus desperate to steal as much as possible before being caught. In a subfolder labeled Legal Options, David had researched embezzlement laws, the process for filing criminal charges, and the steps needed to recover stolen assets. He'd even printed out contact information for several attorneys who specialized in white-collar crime. Documents stood out. Draft email to the district attorney's office, outlining the evidence against Marcus and requesting an investigation. David had never sent the email, but its existence showed how serious he'd been about pursuing legal action. The final file on the USB drive was a video recording. David had made just 2 days before he died. I clicked play and saw my husband's face fill the screen, looking tired and stressed but determined. Megan, if you're watching this, it means something has happened to me, and you found my investigation files. I'm sorry you have to learn about this, especially while you're pregnant. I wanted to handle it myself, to protect you from having to deal with this betrayal. David paused, running his hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was struggling with difficult emotions. Marcus has been stealing from us for over a year. I have all the evidence documented on this drive. The total amount is close to $850,000, but it might be more by the time you find this. I'm going to confront him tomorrow morning and demand that he return the money and turn himself in. If he refuses, I'll have no choice but to involve the police. My husband looked directly into the camera, his eyes filled with love and determination. I need you to know that none of this is your fault, and it doesn't change anything about our future together. We'll get through this, and our daughter will still have everything we planned for her. Marcus may have stolen our money, but he can't steal our love or our family's strength. David's voice broke slightly. I love you both more than anything in the world. If something happens to me before I can resolve this, please use this evidence to protect yourself and our baby. Don't let Marcus manipulate you or make you feel like you can't fight back. You're stronger than you know, and you deserve justice. The video ended, and I sat in the silence of David's office, my heart breaking for everything he'd endured in his final weeks. He'd been carrying this burden alone, trying to protect me from the stress while building a case against the man who was supposed to be his closest friend. That now I knew the truth. Marcus hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been stealing our future, our security, our daughter's inheritance. And David had died trying to stop him. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to my emotional turmoil. I placed my hand on my belly and made a silent promise to both David and our unborn daughter. Marcus thought he could get away with this because David was gone and I was just a grieving, pregnant widow who didn't understand business finances. He thought he could intimidate me into silence and continue stealing what belonged to our family. He was about to learn how wrong he was armed with David's evidence. I spent the weekend conducting my own investigation. Using the information from the USB drive, I was able to piece together the full scope of Marcus's betrayal, and what I discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. The first shock came when I called our business insurance company to verify our coverage. The representative informed me that our policy had been cancelled 3 months ago for non-payment of premiums. That can't be right, I said, my heart sinking. We've never missed a payment. According to our records, Mrs. Carter, the automatic payment from your business account was declined twice, and no manual payment was received within the grace period. Marcus had been stealing so much money that he'd let our insurance lapse. If something happened to one of our job sites, if a worker was injured or if we were sued for defective work, we'd have no coverage. The liability could destroy us financially. Next, I contacted our equipment financing company. David had taken out loans to purchase the company's trucks, excavators, and other heavy machinery, but the equipment should have been nearly paid off by now. Mrs. Carter, I'm showing that your account is currently 90 days past due, the loan officer told me. The total balance remaining is $180,000, and if payment isn't received within 30 days, we'll begin repossession proceedings. My hands shook as I wrote down the numbers. According to David's financial projections, those loans should have been down to less than $40,000. Marcus had been making the minimum payments while pocketing the money that should have been paying down the principal. But the worst discovery came when I researched the fraudulent loan documents I'd found in David's files. Using the account numbers and loan references, I was able to call the bank directly. Yes, Mrs. Carter, I show that loan was approved 6 weeks ago for $150,000, secured against your business equipment and property. The funds were deposited into your business account on March 15th. March 15th was just 2 days after David's funeral. While I was still reeling from grief, while everyone was praising Marcus for his loyalty and support, He'd been at the bank taking out loans in David's name. Can you tell me who signed the loan documents? The signature on file is for David Carter, as the primary owner of Carter and Hoffman Construction. David had been dead for 2 days when that loan was signed. Marcus had used forged documents to steal $150,000 while I was planning my husband's memorial service. Hung up the phone and immediately called Lisa. My voice was shaking so badly I could barely speak. Lisa, it's worse than we thought. Marcus didn't just steal money from the business accounts. He's been taking out loans using David's forged signature. He let our insurance lapse, and he's put us on the verge of losing all our equipment. Slow down, Megan. How much money are we talking about total? I pulled out the notes I'd been making. The direct theft from the business accounts is about $850,000. The fraudulent loans add another $300,000. The equipment loans that should have been paid off still have a balance of $180,000, and we owe back premiums and penalties on the insurance. Jesus, we're looking at well over $1 million. At least. And Lisa, he took out that last loan 2 days after David's funeral, using forged signatures. He was literally stealing from us while people were bringing casseroles and offering condolences. The full picture was devastating. Marcus had essentially hollowed out Carter and Hoffman Construction from the inside, leaving nothing but debt and legal liability. If I didn't act quickly, we'd lose everything: the equipment, the ongoing contracts, even potentially our house if the business debts exceeded our insurance coverage. But the personal betrayal hurt almost as much as the financial devastation. Marcus had been at David's bedside in the hospital, had delivered a beautiful eulogy at the funeral, had promised to take care of me and the baby, all while planning to steal even more money using my dead husband's forged signature. That evening I felt the first real pregnancy complications from the stress. Sharp pains in my abdomen sent me to the emergency room, terrified that I was going into premature labor at 7 months. The doctor, a kind woman in her 50s, ran several tests before reassuring me that the baby was fine. Your blood pressure is elevated, and you're showing signs of significant stress, she said gently. Is there something going on in your life that's causing unusual anxiety? I almost laughed at the understatement. I recently discovered that my business partner has been embezzling from our company. I'm trying to figure out how to handle it legally, while also preparing for the baby. Mrs. Carter, I need you to understand that severe stress during pregnancy can lead to serious complications. Preeclampsia, premature labor, low birth weight, the risks are real. Do you have support systems in place? Family members who can help you through this? I thought about my parents, who lived 3 hours away and were dealing with my father's recent cancer diagnosis. I thought about David's parents, who were still grieving their son and struggling with their own financial problems. I thought about our mutual friends, most of whom were also friends with Marcus, and would find it hard to believe he was capable of such betrayal. I'm mostly handling this alone, I admitted. That's not sustainable, especially not with a high risk pregnancy. I'm going to refer you to a counselor who specializes in trauma and stress management, and I want you to consider whether there are ways to reduce the immediate stresses in your life. On the drive home from the hospital, I realized that I was facing an impossible choice. I could pursue justice against Marcus, but the stress of a legal battle might put my pregnancy at risk. Or I could prioritize my health and my baby's safety, but allow Marcus to get away with destroying everything David had worked to build. As I pulled into our driveway, I saw Marcus's truck parked on the street. He was sitting on our front porch, waiting for me. The sight of him there, in the space where David used to wait for me to come home, filled me with rage. Megan, he said, standing as I got out of my car, I was worried about you. When you didn't answer your phone, I thought something might have happened. What do you want, Marcus? I wanted to apologize for how our conversation went yesterday. I know you're under a lot of stress, and I should have been more patient with your questions. I stared at him, this man who'd been stealing from my family while pretending to be our protector. The audacity was breathtaking. I also wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about the business situation, he continued. With David gone and the baby coming, it might be best if I bought out your share of the company. That way, you'd have a lump sum to invest for the baby's future, and I could handle all the business complications. The offer was perfectly crafted to sound generous while actually being another form of theft. He wanted to buy my share of a company he'd already looted, probably for far less than it was worth, leaving me with pennies on the dollar while he kept everything he'd stolen. How much are you thinking? I asked, curious to see how brazen he'd be. Well, given the current market conditions and the challenges facing the construction industry, I was thinking around $200,000 for your 50% share. $200,000 for half of a company that should have been worth over $1 million before he started stealing from it. He was offering me roughly 20 cents on the dollar for my daughter's inheritance. I'll think about it, I said, pulling out my house key. Don't think too long, Marcus said, and something in his tone made me look at him sharply. Business situations can change quickly, especially in construction. You wouldn't want to wait so long that the offer becomes less attractive. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't friendly advice either. Marcus was making it clear that if I didn't accept his lowball offer soon, things might get worse for me. As I watched him drive away, I realized that this was no longer just about money or justice. Marcus was escalating, becoming more aggressive. In his attempts to silence me and cover up his crimes, I was 7 months pregnant, financially devastated and essentially alone. But I was also David Carter's wife and the mother of his unborn daughter. Marcus had underestimated what that meant. He was about to find out. The morning after Marcus's thinly veiled threat, I woke up with a new sense of determination. I couldn't fight him alone, but I didn't have to. David had built relationships throughout the construction community, and many of those people had genuinely cared about him. I started with Tom Rodriguez, the foreman who'd worked with David on almost every major project for the past 5 years. Tom had been at the funeral, had hugged me with tears in his eyes, and had promised that if I ever needed anything, I should call. Mrs. Carter, Tom said when I reached him on his cell phone, how are you holding up? How's the baby? I'm managing, Tom, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you noticed anything unusual about Marcus lately? Anything that seemed off? There was a long pause. Why do you ask? I've discovered some financial irregularities in the business accounts. I'm trying to understand what's been happening. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Carter, can we meet somewhere private? There are some things I think you should know, but I don't want to talk about them over the phone. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, away from the usual construction industry crowd. Tom looked nervous, glancing around as if he expected Marcus to walk in at any moment. I've been wanting to talk to someone about this since Mr. Carter died, Tom said quietly, but I didn't know who to trust, and I wasn't sure if what I was seeing was really wrong, or if I was just being paranoid. Tell me everything. About 6 months ago, Marcus started showing up at job sites with expensive new tools and equipment that didn't belong to the company. When I asked about it, he said he was testing some new brands for potential purchase. But Mrs. Carter, we're talking about tools worth thousands of dollars, professional grade stuff that he was just using for his personal projects. Tom pulled out his phone and showed me photos he'd taken. I started documenting it because something felt wrong. Look at this, a brand new laser level, worth $4,000. He used it for 1 day on our Riverside project. Then I saw it in his personal truck the next week. Did David know about this? Mr. Carter started asking questions about the tools and equipment around the same time. He seemed concerned about inventory discrepancies. Marcus told him the tools were on loan from suppliers, but I knew that wasn't true. Tom ordered coffee with shaking hands. There's more, Mrs. Carter. I've been on construction sites for 20 years, and I know how billing works. Clients pay progress payments based on completed work, right? But I started noticing that Marcus was billing for materials and labor on projects where the work hadn't been completed yet. What do you mean? For example, on the Morrison house renovation, Marcus billed the client for a complete kitchen remodel in March, but we didn't even start the kitchen work until April, and it wasn't finished until May. When Mrs. Morrison called to complain about being charged for work that hadn't been done, Marcus told her it was just an accounting error and that the billing would be corrected. Did he correct it? Not that. I could see, and it wasn't just the Morrison job. He was doing it on multiple projects, billing clients early, keeping the money in the business accounts for weeks or months, then using it for other things before the actual work got completed. The picture Tom was painting was even worse than what I'd discovered in David's files. Marcus hadn't just been stealing from the business bank accounts, he'd been stealing from clients, using their advance payments to fund his personal expenses and gambling debts. Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Do you think David's heart attack was natural? Tom's face went pale. Mrs. Carter, I can't speculate about something like that. I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm asking if you noticed anything unusual in the days before David died. Any arguments, any confrontations, any signs that he was under unusual stress. Tom was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. The morning Mr. Carter died, he and Marcus had a heated conversation in the trailer office. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see them through the window. Mr. Carter was holding some papers, and Marcus was getting agitated, gesturing with his hands the way he does when he's angry. What happened after that? Marcus left the trailer and didn't come back for about an hour. When he returned, Mr. Carter seemed different, really stressed, maybe even scared. He kept checking his phone, like he was waiting for something important, and that's when he had the heart attack. About 2 hours later, he was working on the foundation measurements when he just collapsed. Marcus was the one who found him. I felt a chill run down my spine. The timeline fit perfectly with what I'd discovered in David's files. David had confronted Marcus that morning about the theft, and within hours he was dead. Tom, if I asked you to testify about what you've seen and heard, would you be willing to do that? Mrs. Carter, I've got a family to support, and construction is a small community. If I get a reputation as someone who causes trouble, I might not be able to find work. I understand. But Marcus has stolen almost $1 million from the company David built. He's billing clients for work that hasn't been done, and he's trying to force me to sell my share of the business for a fraction of what it's worth. If we don't stop him, he'll destroy everything David worked for. Tom looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Mr. Carter was a good man. He treated me fairly, paid me well, and never asked me to do anything dishonest. If Marcus is doing what you think he's doing, then yes, I'll testify. After leaving the diner, I made similar calls to 3 other employees and subcontractors. Each conversation revealed new details about Marcus's behavior, his expensive gambling trips, his new luxury car, his mysterious absences from job sites. The most significant call was to David's insurance agent, a family friend named Robert Chen who'd handled our policies for years. Megan, I'm so glad you called, Robert said. I've been trying to reach Marcus about renewing your business liability insurance, but he keeps telling me to wait a few more weeks. The lapse in coverage is making me nervous, especially with your active job sites. Robert, I need to ask you something confidential. When David took out his life insurance policy, did he say anything about his concerns regarding the business or his health? Actually, yes. When we reviewed his coverage last year, he specifically asked about increasing the policy amount. He said he was worried about leaving you and the baby financially vulnerable if something happened to him. Did he mention any specific concerns? He said he was dealing with some business stress and wanted to make sure you'd be protected regardless of what happened with the company. He seemed particularly concerned about protecting you from any business debts or liabilities. The life insurance policy, I'd completely forgotten about it in the chaos of everything else. David had been planning ahead, trying to protect me and the baby even if the business was destroyed by Marcus's theft. That evening, I sat in David's office reading his personal journal, which I'd found in the bottom drawer of his desk. The entries from his final weeks painted a picture of a man struggling with the devastating realization that his best friend was betraying him. Marcus came by the house tonight to see Megan, one entry read. He was charming and solicitous as always, asking about the baby and offering to help with anything we need. But I kept thinking about the forged signatures, the missing money, the lies he's been telling. How can someone be so convincing when they're living a complete double life? Another entry, written just 4 days before he died. I love Marcus, like a brother, but I have to face the truth. He's been systematically stealing from us, and he's gotten so comfortable with it that he's not even being careful anymore. The question is whether he'll come clean when I confront him, or if he'll try to destroy me to cover his tracks. The final entry was heartbreaking. Tomorrow I'm going to give Marcus one last chance to do the right thing. If he refuses, I'll have no choice but to involve the police. I'm scared about what this will do to the business, but I'm more scared about what will happen to Megan and the baby if I don't stop him now. I pray I'm strong enough to see this through. David had been strong enough. He'd gathered the evidence, confronted Marcus, and died before he could see justice done. But his investigation had given me everything I needed to finish what he'd started. I was no longer fighting this battle alone. I had allies, evidence, and most importantly, I had the truth on my side. Marcus thought he could intimidate a grieving pregnant widow into accepting his theft and walking away quietly. He was about to learn that David Carter's wife was stronger than he'd ever imagined. On Monday morning, I walked into the law offices of Patterson and Associates with a folder containing every piece of evidence David had gathered, plus everything I'd discovered since his death. Lisa had recommended Sarah Patterson, a criminal defense attorney who also handled white-collar crime cases. Sarah was a woman in her early 40s with grey-streaked hair and an intense, focused demeanor. She listened without interruption as I laid out the entire story, occasionally making notes but mostly just absorbing the scope of Marcus's betrayal. Mrs. Carter, she said when I finished, this is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've seen. Your husband did exceptional investigative work. The evidence you have here could support charges for embezzlement, forgery, mail fraud, and possibly racketeering if we can prove a pattern of fraudulent billing to clients. What are my chances of getting the money back? The criminal cases, very strong. The civil recovery will depend on whether Marcus still has assets we can attach. If he's gambled away everything he stole, you might win a judgment but never collect on it. Sarah explained the process. First, we'd file a police report and request a criminal investigation. Simultaneously, we'd file civil lawsuits for embezzlement and fraud, seeking both compensatory and punitive damages. We'd also seek immediate injunctions to prevent Marcus from disposing of any remaining assets. I have to warn you, Sarah said. This is going to be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Defense attorneys in cases like this often try to discredit the victim, especially when the primary witness is deceased. They might try to suggest that your husband was complicit in the missing funds, or that your grief has made you paranoid and unstable. Let them try, I said firmly. I have David's investigation files, witness testimony, and bank records. The truth is on my side. Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Good, that's the attitude you'll need to get through this. We spent the next 3 hours going through every document, organizing the evidence into chronological order, and identifying the strongest pieces of proof. Sarah was particularly interested in the USB drive with David's video testimony and the forged signature samples. This video could be powerful evidence of your husband's state of mind and his concerns about Marcus's behavior, she said. And these practice signatures are damning. We'll need a handwriting expert to authenticate them, but they clearly show premeditation. By the end of our meeting, we had a strategy. Sarah would file the police report that afternoon, requesting an immediate investigation into Marcus's financial crimes. She'd also prepare civil lawsuits seeking full restitution, plus damages for the emotional distress and business losses his theft had caused. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as I gathered. "My documents. Given that Marcus has already approached you about buying out your share of the business, and given his veiled threats, I'm concerned about your safety. He's stolen over $1 million, and people have killed for much less." The thought had occurred to me that hearing it from an experienced attorney made it more real. What should I do? First, don't meet with him alone anymore. If he wants to discuss business matters, insist that attorneys be present. Second, document any threats or intimidation attempts. And third, consider whether you'd feel safer staying with family or friends while this plays out. That afternoon, Sarah called to tell me the police had accepted the case and would be opening a formal investigation. Detective Michelle Torres from the Financial Crimes Unit would be contacting me within 24 hours to schedule an interview, but Marcus moved faster than we'd anticipated. I was at home that evening, eating dinner and reviewing some of David's project files, when my phone rang. It was Marcus, and his voice was cold and controlled in a way I'd never heard before. "Megan, I understand you've been talking to attorneys and making accusations about me." My heart started racing. "How did you find out about that?" "This is a small town, and the legal community is even smaller. Sarah Patterson called my attorney this afternoon." I hadn't realized that Sarah would contact Marcus's attorney so quickly, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "I'm just trying to understand what happened to our business finances. What happened is that you're a grieving widow who's letting her imagination run wild. David and I were equal partners in that business, and every financial decision we made was mutual. That's not what the evidence shows." "Evidence?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean David's paranoid fantasies and your pregnancy-addled misinterpretations of normal business transactions?" The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. This was the man who'd promised to take care of me and the baby, who'd spoken so beautifully at David's funeral about friendship and loyalty. "Marcus, I have bank records showing systematic theft. I have practice sheets where someone was learning to forge David's signature." You have nothing," he interrupted. "You have a dead husband's suspicions and your own desperate need to blame someone for your financial problems. My financial problems that you created by stealing almost $1 million. Prove it." His voice was now openly threatening. "Take me to court, Megan. Let's see how well a pregnant widow holds up under cross-examination. Let's see what happens when my attorney starts asking questions about David's mental state in those final weeks, about whether the stress of impending fatherhood made him paranoid and delusional." I felt sick. Marcus was going to try to destroy David's reputation to cover his own crimes. "You know what I think happened?" Marcus continued. "I think David was having some kind of mental breakdown, maybe even embezzling money himself to cover gambling debts or other problems he was hiding from you. And now you're trying to blame me for his mistakes because you can't bear to face the truth about the man you married. That's a lie, and you know it. Is it? Can you prove David wasn't gambling? Can you prove he wasn't having an affair? Can you prove he wasn't planning to leave you and disappear with the business money?" Each accusation was like a physical blow. Marcus was systematically trying to destroy my faith in David, to make me doubt everything I knew about my husband. "I'm going to give you one last chance," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Drop this ridiculous investigation, accept my bailout offer, and walk away quietly. Focus on having a healthy baby instead of chasing conspiracy theories. And if I don't, then you'll discover that fighting me is more expensive and more painful than you can imagine. I have resources, Megan. I have connections. I have 8 years of detailed knowledge about this business and your personal finances. If you want to go to war with me, I promise you'll lose everything." The call ended, and I sat in the silence of our empty house, my hand on my belly, feeling the baby's anxious movements. Marcus had just confirmed everything I'd suspected about him. He was ruthless, calculating, and willing to destroy anyone who threatened him. But he'd also made a crucial mistake. He'd threatened me directly, and Sarah had told me to document any intimidation attempts. I immediately called Sarah's emergency number and left a detailed voicemail about the conversation, including Marcus's threats and his accusations against David. Then I called Detective Torres and did the same. The next morning, Sarah called me back with news that both reassured and terrified me. The good news is that Marcus's phone call last night probably constitutes witness intimidation, which is a felony. The detective wants to meet with you immediately to discuss protective measures. What's the bad news? The bad news is that Marcus is clearly preparing for an all-out legal war. He's hired Camden, Wells and Associates, one of the most expensive defense firms in the state. They specialize in white-collar crime, and they're very good at what they do. I felt the baby kick sharply, as if responding to my surge of anxiety. This was no longer just about recovering stolen money. Marcus was going to try to destroy David's memory, question my sanity, and paint me as a delusional widow who couldn't accept her husband's supposed crimes. But I had something Marcus didn't expect: David's meticulous investigation, witness testimony, and now evidence of Marcus's own threatening behavior. The legal battle was just beginning, but I was ready to fight for my family's future and my husband's legacy. Marcus had underestimated the strength of David Carter's wife. He was about to learn the cost of that mistake. Marcus's counterattack came swiftly and viciously. 3 days after our phone conversation, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. Inside was a letter from Camden, Wells and Associates that made my blood run cold. The letter accused me of making false and defamatory statements about Marcus Hoffman and threatened to sue me for libel if I continued my campaign of harassment. But the worst part was a psychological evaluation report they'd commissioned, supposedly based on interviews with concerned friends and family members who were worried about my mental state. According to the report, I was suffering from severe pregnancy-induced paranoia and grief-related delusional thinking that had led me to create an elaborate conspiracy theory about Marcus's supposed theft. The report cited my emotional instability, my irrational accusations, and my inability to cope with the reality of widowhood. The document was signed by Dr. Harrison Blake, a psychiatrist I'd never met or spoken to. Somehow Marcus's attorneys had convinced a licensed mental health professional to write a report declaring me unfit without ever conducting an actual evaluation. But the cruelest blow was the final paragraph. Given Mrs. Carter's deteriorating mental state and her inability to distinguish reality from fantasy, serious consideration should be given to whether she is capable of providing appropriate care for her unborn child. Immediate psychiatric intervention is recommended to prevent further psychological deterioration. Marcus wasn't just trying to discredit my accusations, he was questioning my fitness as a mother. I called Sarah immediately, my voice shaking with rage and fear. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Sarah said after I read her the letter. "Marcus's attorneys are trying to establish a pattern of mental instability that they can use to discredit your testimony and evidence. That this psychiatrist never even met me. How can he write a report about my mental state? That's the first thing we're going to challenge. What they've done is probably unethical and possibly illegal. I'm going to file a complaint with the state medical board and demand to know who these concerned friends and family are who supposedly provided information for this evaluation. Sarah, they're threatening to take my baby away. They're posturing. Megan, they can't take your child based on a bogus psychiatric report from a doctor who never examined you. But we need to be proactive about this. I want you to see a real psychiatrist, someone we choose who can evaluate your mental state and provide a legitimate assessment." That afternoon brought another shock. I was in David's office, organizing documents for Sarah, when I heard a commotion outside. Through the window, I saw a news van pulling into our driveway. A perfectly coiffed reporter and her cameraman were setting up equipment on my front lawn. I watched in horror as she began speaking into the camera, our house serving as the backdrop for whatever story she was about to tell. I crept closer to the window to listen. This is Amanda Pierce reporting from the home of Megan Carter, the widow, who has made shocking accusations against her late husband's business partner. Sources close to the situation tell Channel 7 News that Mrs. Carter, who is 7 months pregnant, may be suffering from a psychological breakdown that has led her to make false claims about embezzlement and fraud. The story continued for 2 excruciating minutes, presenting Marcus as a loyal friend trying to help a disturbed widow, while portraying me as an unstable woman whose grief had driven her to paranoid delusions. They even included a soundbite from Dr. Blake, the psychiatrist who'd never met me, expressing concern about my documented emotional instability. I called Sarah in a panic. There are news cameras in my yard, and they're running a story about how I'm mentally unstable. They can't legally film on your property without permission. I'm calling the police right now to have them removed. But Megan, this confirms that Marcus is playing hardball. He's trying to control the narrative before our evidence becomes public. The police arrived and moved the news crew off my property, but the damage was done. By evening, the story was everywhere: local news, social media, even some of the construction industry websites. Marcus had successfully painted himself as the victim and me as the villain. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, neighbors, and even strangers who'd seen the news story. Some were supportive, but others were cruel. One caller told me I was a crazy bitch who was trying to destroy a good man's reputation. Another suggested that maybe my baby would be better off with adoptive parents who weren't mentally defective. The stress was overwhelming. I felt the baby moving restlessly, responding to my elevated heart rate and blood pressure. When I started having sharp pains in my abdomen, I knew I needed to get to the hospital. Dr. Martinez, my obstetrician, examined me with a concerned expression. Megan, your blood pressure is dangerously high, and you're showing early signs of preeclampsia. I need you to understand that severe stress during pregnancy can be life-threatening for both you and the baby. Doctor, I'm in the middle of a legal battle. My husband's business partner stole almost $1 million, and now he's trying to make people think I'm crazy. I understand that you're dealing with serious problems, but you have to prioritize your health right now. If your blood pressure doesn't come down, we might need to deliver the baby early. The thought of my daughter being born prematurely because of Marcus's psychological warfare filled me with rage. He wasn't just stealing money anymore, he was literally threatening my child's health and safety. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed with monitors tracking my blood pressure and the baby's heartbeat, I made a decision. Marcus wanted a war, and he was willing to use any weapon available, including attacking my mental health and threatening my fitness as a mother. That he'd made a critical error. Every lie he told, every false accusation he made, every unethical tactic he employed was being documented. Sarah was building a case not just for embezzlement, but for witness intimidation, harassment, and defamation. Marcus thought he could destroy me the way he destroyed David's business. He thought a pregnant widow would be too vulnerable, too isolated, too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. He was wrong. Every attack he made on me only strengthened my resolve to see him brought to justice. When the nurse came to check on me at midnight, she found me sitting up in bed, making notes on a legal pad. Mrs. Carter, you should be resting. I am resting, I said, continuing to write. I'm resting up for the fight of my life. The baby kicked strongly, as if she agreed with my determination. Marcus had declared war on our family, but he was about to discover that David Carter's wife and daughter were stronger than he'd ever imagined. After 2 days in the hospital, I was released with strict instructions to minimize stress and monitor my blood pressure daily. But Sarah had news that would make stress reduction impossible. She'd hired a private investigator, and his findings were explosive. James Mitchell was a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes. Sarah had briefed him on our case, and he'd spent the past week conducting his own investigation into Marcus's activities. Mrs. Carter, James said when we met at Sarah's office, your husband was a very thorough investigator. But he only scratched the surface of Marcus Hoffman's criminal activities. James opened a thick folder and spread photographs across the conference table. The images showed Marcus at various casinos, but not just local ones, high-end establishments in Las Vegas, Atlantic City, and even Monte Carlo. According to casino records I was able to obtain, Marcus has gambling debts exceeding $400,000. He's been flying to these casinos monthly, sometimes weekly, using company credit cards to pay for flights and hotels. The business was paying for his gambling trips? Not just the trips. Look at this. James showed me credit card statements that made my stomach turn. Marcus had been charging everything to Carter and Hoffman Construction luxury hotel suites, expensive meals, even cash advances that he'd used for gambling. But here's the most interesting part, James continued. Marcus isn't just a gambler, he's also been running what appears to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. James explained that H&S Consulting, the company that had been receiving the stolen funds from our business accounts, was just one of several shell companies Marcus had created. He'd established a network of fake businesses, each with its own bank account, and had been moving money between them to hide the trail of his theft. He's not just stealing from your business, James said. I've identified at least 3 other construction companies where Marcus has been listed as a consultant or project manager. In each case, there are similar patterns of financial irregularities. Sarah leaned forward. Are you saying Marcus has done this before? I'm saying Marcus Hoffman is a serial embezzler who specifically targets family-owned construction businesses. He gains the trust of the owners, gradually assumes control of the financial operations, then systematically loots the companies while maintaining the facade of a loyal partner or employee. James showed us a timeline he'd constructed. Marcus's pattern was always the same. He'd work legitimately for the first few years, building trust and taking on more financial responsibilities. Then he'd begin small thefts, testing whether the owners noticed discrepancies. If he wasn't caught, the thefts would escalate until he'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. In 2 previous cases, the business owners discovered the theft and confronted Marcus. In both instances, those men died within weeks of the confrontation. My blood went cold. What do you mean, they died? Richard Kowalski, owner of Kowalski Brothers Construction in Ohio, confronted Marcus about missing funds in February 2018. He died of a heart attack 3 weeks later. James Freeman, owner of Freeman and Associates in North Carolina, discovered Marcus's embezzlement in August 2019. He died in a single-car accident 2 weeks after filing a police report. Sarah and I stared at each other in horror. Are you suggesting that Marcus killed these men? I'm suggesting that the pattern is suspicious enough to warrant investigation. 3 healthy men in their 30s and 40s, all of whom discovered Marcus's theft, all of whom died suddenly before they could testify against him or recover their stolen assets. James opened another folder. But here's what's really interesting in each previous case. Marcus approached the widows with offers to buy out their shares of the businesses for far less than they were worth. And in each case, when the widows refused, Marcus launched campaigns to discredit them, including commissioning psychological evaluations questioning their mental fitness. The parallels to my own situation were terrifying and unmistakable. Marcus had used the same playbook before steal. From the business, kill or wait for the owner to die, then pressure the widow to sell her share for pennies on the dollar. Mrs. Carter, I need to ask you directly, have you experienced any symptoms that might suggest poisoning? Unusual fatigue, digestive issues, dizziness, anything that seems out of place? I thought about the severe stress symptoms I'd been experiencing, the elevated blood pressure, the abdominal pains that had sent me to the hospital. I've been having health problems, but my doctor says they're stress-related. I'd recommend having blood work done to test for toxins. Given Marcus's pattern of behavior, we can't rule out the possibility that he's attempting to harm you as well. Sarah was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling your obstetrician, right now. We need comprehensive toxicology testing, and we need it today. James continued his briefing while Sarah made the call. The good news is that Marcus has gotten sloppy. He's using the same methods he's used before, and now that we know his pattern, we can predict his next moves. What do you think he'll do next? He'll try to isolate you from your support systems. He'll ramp up the psychological pressure, possibly through more media coverage or legal harassment. And if those tactics don't work, he may resort to more direct threats or actions. James handed me a small device that looked like a car key fob. This is a panic button. If you feel threatened, press it and hold for 3 seconds. It will immediately alert the police to your location and send a distress signal to both Sarah and me. The reality of my situation was sinking in. I wasn't just fighting a civil lawsuit over stolen money. I was potentially dealing with a serial killer who had murdered at least 2 other men and was now targeting me. There's one more thing, James said quietly. I've been monitoring Marcus's communications, and he's been in contact with someone he refers to as the cleaner. I don't know who this person is yet, but the context suggests it's someone who helps him eliminate problems. Sarah finished her phone call and rejoined us. Dr. Martinez wants to see you immediately for blood work. She's also going to test samples of anything you've been eating or drinking regularly. As we prepared to leave for the hospital, James gave me final instructions. Don't eat or drink anything that Marcus could have had access to. Don't meet with him alone under any circumstances. And trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Driving to the hospital, I felt my baby moving restlessly inside me, as if she could sense the danger we were in. Marcus wasn't just a thief, he was a predator who had been hunting families like mine for years. But unlike his previous victims, I had something he didn't expect. Advance warning of his methods and a team of professionals who understood his pattern. David had started the investigation that would bring Marcus down. Now it was my responsibility to finish it, not just for our family, but for Richard Kowalski and James Freeman and any other victims Marcus might have claimed. The blood tests would tell us whether Marcus had already tried to poison me, but regardless of what they showed, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just about money or justice. This was about survival. The toxicology results came back 2 days later, and Dr. Martinez delivered the news with a grim expression. Megan, we found traces of a compound called oleander extract in your blood. It's a plant-based toxin that can cause exactly the symptoms you've been experiencing: elevated blood pressure, abdominal pain, and cardiac stress. My worst fears were confirmed. Marcus hadn't just been stealing money and discrediting my reputation, he'd been slowly poisoning me. Is the baby okay? I asked, my hand instinctively moving to my belly. The levels weren't high enough to cause permanent damage, but prolonged exposure could have been fatal for both of you. The fact that you're at 32 weeks and the baby is still developing normally suggests that the poisoning was recent and relatively low dose. Sarah, who'd accompanied me to the appointment, was already on her phone with Detective Torres. We need to treat this as attempted murder, she said. Megan, this changes everything about our legal strategy. James Mitchell met us at the police station to deliver his final report. He'd traced the oleander poisoning to a sympathy meal that Marcus had brought to my house the week after David's funeral. A homemade lasagna that he'd insisted I eat to keep my strength up for the baby. The oleander extract was probably mixed into the sauce, James explained. It's tasteless and odorless, and the symptoms would have appeared days later, making it nearly impossible to trace back to the source. Detective Torres shook her head in disgust. So while he was playing the grieving friend at the funeral, he was already planning to poison the widow. It fits his pattern, James said. Create the appearance of being helpful and supportive while systematically destroying his victim's health, reputation, and financial stability. But Marcus had made a crucial error. In his arrogance, he'd kept the container he'd used to transport the poisoned lasagna, and James had been able to retrieve it from Marcus's trash. Laboratory analysis had confirmed the presence of oleander residue. The evidence against Marcus was now overwhelming: embezzlement, forgery, witness intimidation, defamation, and attempted murder. But Sarah warned me that the hardest part was still ahead. Marcus's attorneys are going to claim that the poisoning was accidental, that maybe the oleander contamination came from environmental sources. They'll say that your accusations have become increasingly desperate and unhinged as your mental state deteriorated. How can they possibly argue that? They'll point to the timing. You discovered the financial irregularities, then suddenly you're claiming attempted murder. They'll frame it as a paranoid escalation from a grieving widow who can't accept that her husband might have been involved in the missing money. The thought of Marcus's defense strategy made me feel sick all over again. Even with proof of poisoning, he was going to try to make me seem like a delusional woman who was making increasingly wild accusations. 3 days later, I received another devastating blow. I was at home, resting on doctor's orders, when I felt an unusual cramping sensation. Within minutes, the cramps had become intense. Regular contractions. Dr. Martinez met me at the hospital emergency room with a team of specialists. After a frantic examination, she delivered news that made my world spin. "Megan, you're in premature labor. The stress from everything you've been through, combined with the effects of the oleander poisoning, has triggered early contractions. We're going to try to stop the labor with medications, but if we can't, we may need to deliver the baby tonight." I was only 32 weeks pregnant. My daughter wasn't supposed to be born for another 2 months. What are her chances if she's born now? Babies born at 32 weeks have about a 95% survival rate. But there can be complications, breathing problems, developmental delays, feeding difficulties. We'll do everything we can to give her the best possible start. As I lay in the hospital bed with 4 medications trying to stop my contractions, Sarah sat beside me coordinating our legal response. The attempted murder charge had elevated our case to the district attorney's office, and they were preparing to arrest Marcus within the next 48 hours. "The timing isn't ideal," Sarah said gently. "If you give birth now, Marcus's attorneys will argue that your premature labor proves you were too unstable to be a reliable witness. They'll say the stress of making false accusations literally drove you into early labor. So what do? We fight. We have the evidence, we have the pattern of previous victims, and now we have proof of attempted murder. Your medical records will show that the premature labor was caused by poisoning, not by stress from making accusations." The medications worked, and my contractions gradually stopped. But Dr. Martinez was blunt about my situation. I was now on complete bed rest for the remainder of my pregnancy, and any additional stress could trigger labor again. "I know you're dealing with legal issues," she said, "but your priority has to be keeping this baby safe until she's ready to be born." That evening, as I lay in the hospital bed listening to my daughter's heartbeat on the monitor, I made a difficult decision. I called Sarah and told her to proceed with all legal actions, without waiting for me to be present. File the charges, schedule the depositions, do whatever needs to be done. I can't risk my daughter's life by continuing to attend meetings and court hearings. "Megan, are you sure? Your presence and testimony will be crucial to the case. Then, we'll do video depositions from the hospital if necessary. But I won't let Marcus hurt my baby the way he hurt David." 2 days later, Detective Torres called with news that both thrilled and terrified me. Marcus had been arrested on charges of embezzlement, forgery, and attempted murder. He was being held without bail, pending a psychiatric evaluation to determine whether he was competent to stand trial. "The arrest didn't go smoothly," Torres said. "When we arrived at his house with the warrant, Marcus barricaded himself inside and threatened to commit suicide rather than face trial. It took 4 hours to talk him down." Marcus's dramatic response to arrest seemed to confirm everything James had discovered about his psychological profile. He was a narcissist who couldn't tolerate the idea of being exposed and held accountable for his crimes. But even from jail, Marcus continued to wage psychological warfare. His attorneys filed emergency motions claiming that my false accusations had driven their client to a mental breakdown, and they requested that I undergo a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation before being allowed to testify. The judge denied their request. But the motion served its purpose, generating more negative media coverage that portrayed me as a vengeful widow whose lies had destroyed an innocent man's life. As I monitored the news coverage from my hospital bed, I realized that Marcus had succeeded in turning my fight for justice into a public spectacle. Half the community believed I was a brave woman seeking justice for my family. The other half believed I was a mentally unstable widow whose paranoid accusations had driven a good man to the brink of suicide. I no longer cared about public opinion. My daughter was safe, Marcus was in jail, and the evidence would speak for itself in court. The legal battle was far from over, but for the first time since David's death, I felt like we were winning. Marcus's deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November, and despite my doctor's protests, I insisted on attending. At 34 weeks pregnant and still on bed rest, I wasn't supposed to be sitting in a conference room for hours, but I needed to see Marcus face the evidence we'd gathered against him. Sarah had prepared me for what to expect. His attorneys are going to try to rattle you, make you seem emotional or unstable. Remember, everything you say is being recorded and can be used in court later. The deposition was held at the offices of Camden, Wells and Associates, Marcus's law firm. The conference room was intimidating, with dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling law books, designed to project power and authority. Marcus looked different than I'd ever seen him. Gone was the confident, charming man who delivered David's eulogy. His face was gaunt, his hands shook slightly, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. 3 months in jail had clearly taken a toll. His lead attorney, Richard Camden, was exactly what I'd expected: an expensive suit, perfectly styled grey hair, and the kind of practiced arrogance that comes from winning cases through intimidation rather than evidence. Mrs. Carter, Camden began after the court reporter had sworn me in, let's start with your mental health. Have you been under the care of a psychiatrist since your husband's death? I've been seeing a counselor to help cope with grief, yes. And have you been prescribed any medications for anxiety, depression, or other psychological conditions? Sarah objected. The witness's medical history isn't relevant to the embezzlement charges against your client. It's relevant to her credibility and her ability to accurately perceive and remember events. Camden replied smoothly. For the next hour, Camden tried to establish that grief and pregnancy hormones had made me an unreliable witness. He questioned every detail of my story, suggesting that I'd misinterpreted normal business transactions and created an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid facing the reality of David's supposed financial problems. But when Sarah began questioning Marcus, the dynamic shifted completely. Mr. Hoffman, can you explain why H&S Consulting received over $800,000 from Carter and Hoffman Construction? Marcus's answer was rambling and contradictory. H&S provided specialized consulting services, project management, financial analysis, strategic planning, all services that David and I agreed were necessary for the business. Can you provide any contracts or invoices for these services? The documentation was lost when David died. He kept most of the consulting records in his personal files. Sarah placed a stack of bank records in front of Marcus. These records show that money transferred to H&S Consulting was immediately transferred to your personal account. Can you explain why you were personally receiving payment for consulting services supposedly provided by a separate company? Marcus's explanation became even more convoluted. He claimed that H&S was a sole proprietorship that he owned, that the transfers to his personal account were legitimate payments for his work, and that David had approved all of the transactions. Mr. Hoffman, if David approved these transactions, why do we have evidence that he was investigating the payments and questioning their legitimacy? David was under a lot of stress in his final weeks. The pregnancy, financial pressures, responsibility of becoming a father, it was affecting his judgment. He was becoming paranoid about normal business operations. Sarah then showed Marcus the practice signature sheets we'd found in David's files. Can you explain why these documents were found in your handwriting, apparently showing attempts to replicate David Carter's signature? For the first time, Marcus hesitated significantly before answering. I don't know what those documents are. I've never seen them before. The handwriting analysis shows that these practice sheets were written by the same person who forged David Carter's signature on multiple financial documents. Are you claiming you didn't write these? I'm claiming I don't know what those documents are or where they came from. Sarah placed another document in front of Marcus, the bank loan application that had been signed with David's forged signature 2 days after the funeral. Mr. Hoffman, this loan application was submitted on March 15th. David Carter died on March 13th. Can you explain how he could have signed this document? Marcus stared at the document for a long time, his hands visibly shaking. I don't know. Maybe there was an error in the dates. Maybe the bank processed it late. The bank's records show that you appeared in person to submit this application. The signature card shows that you signed David Carter's name in the presence of a bank officer. Are you saying you didn't forge this signature? I'm saying I don't remember the specific details of that transaction. Sarah continued methodically through the evidence, the gambling debts, the shell companies, the pattern of theft from previous employers. With each piece of evidence, Marcus's responses became more desperate and contradictory. The breaking point came when Sarah played David's video testimony from the USB drive. Watching my husband's face on the conference room screen, hearing him describe Marcus's betrayal and his fears for our family's future, was emotionally devastating, but Marcus's reaction was even more telling. As David spoke about the evidence he'd gathered and his plans to confront Marcus, I watched the man who'd been my husband's supposed best friend. There was no grief, no remorse, no sadness at seeing David's final message. There was only cold calculation as Marcus tried to figure out how to counter this devastating evidence. When the video ended, Camden tried to salvage his client's position. Mr. Huffman, do you have any response to the allegations made in that video? Marcus leaned toward the microphone, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with venom. David Carter was a paranoid, jealous man who couldn't accept that his business partner was more successful than he was. He created that video because he was planning to frame me for his own financial crimes. The accusation was so outrageous, so clearly contradicted by all the evidence that even Camden looked surprised. Mr. Hoffman, are you claiming that David Carter embezzled money from his own company? I'm claiming that David Carter was not the saint his widow wants everyone to believe he was. He had gambling problems, he was having marital difficulties, and he was looking for someone to blame for his financial mistakes. I couldn't stay silent any longer. That's a lie, and you know it. Camden immediately objected to my outburst, but the damage was done. Marcus had revealed his true character, showing the same callous cruelty he'd displayed during our phone conversation weeks earlier. After 6 hours of testimony, Marcus's deposition was complete. His story was full of holes, his explanations were contradictory, and his attempts to blame David for the embezzlement were obviously false. As we packed up our documents, Camden made one final attempt to intimidate me. Mrs. Carter, I hope you understand that this deposition will be used to cross-examine you at trial. Every inconsistency, every emotional outburst, every sign of instability will be scrutinized by a jury. Let them scrutinize, I replied. I'm telling the truth, and the evidence proves it. Driving home from the deposition, Sarah was optimistic about our chances at trial. Marcus buried himself today. His story doesn't make sense, and his attempt to blame David was so obviously false that it actually helped our case. What happens next? The district attorney will use today's testimony to finalize the criminal charges, and will use it to strengthen our civil case for recovering the stolen money. That evening, as I felt my daughter moving actively inside me, I realized that the hardest part of the battle was over. Marcus had been exposed as a liar and a thief. His attempts to discredit me had failed, and justice was finally within reach. David's investigation had provided the foundation, but today had been the moment when Marcus's own words and behavior had sealed his fate. My husband's killer was going to face consequences for his crimes. 2 weeks after Marcus's disastrous deposition, I woke up at 3 in the morning with unmistakable contractions. This time, there was no stopping the labor. My daughter had decided she was ready to meet the world. Even though she was still 5 weeks early. Dr. Martinez met me at the hospital with her usual calm efficiency, but I could see concern in her eyes. Megan, at 35 weeks, the baby should be fine, but we need to be prepared for potential complications. Her lungs might not be fully developed, and she could need help breathing initially. Sarah arrived at the hospital just as I was being wheeled into the delivery room. "The timing is actually perfect," she said, squeezing my hand. "Marcus's trial is set to begin next month, and you'll have time to recover before you need to testify." Labor progressed quickly, and at 6:47 a.m. on November 18th, Emma Grace Carter entered the world. She was tiny, just 4 pounds 12 ounces, but her cry was strong and indignant, as if she was annoyed at being evicted from her comfortable home early. "She's beautiful," Dr. Martinez said, placing Emma on my chest for a brief moment before the NICU team took over. "Her breathing is good, her color is excellent, and her reflexes are strong. I think she's going to be just fine." As I watched the medical team examining my daughter, I felt a profound sense of completion. David would never hold Emma, never see her take her first steps or hear her say, "Daddy." But she was here, she was healthy, and she was proof that Marcus hadn't succeeded in destroying our family. Emma spent 3 days in the NICU for observation, but she quickly proved that Carter determination ran in her genes. She mastered bottle feeding, maintained her body temperature, and gained weight steadily. On her 4th day of life, I was finally able to take her home. The house felt different with Emma in it. The silence that had been so oppressive since David's death was now filled with baby sounds, soft breathing, tiny cries, the gentle creaking of the rocking chair as I fed her. For the first time in months, our home felt like a place where life was beginning rather than ending. 3 weeks after Emma's birth, Sarah called with the news I'd been waiting for. Marcus's attorneys have approached the district attorney about a plea deal. They want to avoid a trial where all the evidence becomes public record. What kind of deal are they offering? Full restitution of all stolen funds, plus interest and penalties. Marcus would plead guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges, and serve a minimum of 5 years in prison. In exchange, the attempted murder charges would be reduced to assault with a deadly weapon. I felt conflicted about the plea deal. Part of me wanted Marcus to face trial for everything he'd done, including David's death and the attempt on my life. But another part of me recognized the practical advantages of avoiding a lengthy trial while I was caring for a newborn. "What do you recommend?" "I think we should accept it, with one modification. I want Marcus to publicly admit to the embezzlement and apologize for the damage he's caused to your family. No more claims that David was mentally unstable or that you made false accusations." The final negotiation took place in the district attorney's office, with Marcus present in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. He looked broken. His arrogance had been replaced by the hollow stare of a man who'd lost everything. When it came time for Marcus to make his statement, his voice was barely audible. "I stole money from Carter and Hoffman Construction over a period of 18 months. I forged David Carter's signature on multiple documents, and I attempted to cover up my crimes by discrediting his widow. David Carter was an honest man who discovered my theft and tried to stop me. I'm responsible for the financial losses suffered by the Carter family, and I apologize for the pain I've caused." The words felt inadequate for the magnitude of his betrayal, but they were an official admission of guilt that would prevent him from ever again claiming that David or I were responsible for the missing money. The final settlement amounted to $1.2 million, not just the stolen money, but additional damages for the emotional distress, medical expenses, and business losses his crimes had caused. It was more money than David and I had ever dreamed of having, and it would secure Emma's future in ways we'd never imagined possible. But the most satisfying part of the resolution wasn't financial, it was the restoration of David's reputation. The district attorney's office issued a public statement clearing David of any wrongdoing and praising his thorough investigation of Marcus's crimes. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the case, describing David as a hero who died trying to protect his family from a trusted friend's betrayal. The same reporters who'd questioned my mental stability months earlier now wanted interviews about my courage in pursuing justice while pregnant and grieving. I declined most of them, but I did agree to one interview with the local paper, because I wanted other families to know the warning signs of financial abuse. Marcus Hoffman was a master manipulator, I told the reporter. He spent years building trust and establishing himself as indispensable before he began stealing. But there were small discrepancies that grew larger over time. Changes in financial procedures that didn't make sense, and attempts to isolate business owners from their own financial information. 3 weeks after the plea agreement was finalized, I received an unexpected visitor. Patricia, David's mother, had driven down from Oregon to meet her granddaughter for the first time. "I owe you an apology," she said, as she held Emma carefully in her arms. "When Marcus first started spreading rumors about your mental state, I thought maybe grief had made you paranoid. I should have trusted David's judgment about you. You don't need to apologize. Marcus was very convincing." "He was, but David always said you were the strongest person he knew. He said that if anything ever happened to him, you'd fight for your family no matter what obstacles you faced." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. He was right. Looking at Emma sleeping peacefully in her grandmother's arms, I felt the first real sense of closure since David's death. Marcus was in prison, the money was recovered, and David's reputation was restored. But most importantly, our daughter would grow up knowing that her father had been a hero who died protecting our family's future. That evening, I sat in David's workshop, which I'd converted into a nursery for Emma. The ultrasound photo that had sat on his workbench was now framed on the wall next to Emma's crib. A reminder of the dreams David had cherished during those final weeks of his life. As I rocked Emma to sleep, I told her the story of her father, how he'd built a successful business through hard work and integrity, how he discovered his best friend's betrayal and fought to protect our future, and how his investigation had ultimately brought justice and security to our family. "Your daddy loved you before you were even born," I whispered to Emma. "He made sure you'd be safe, even though he couldn't be here to see you grow up." Emma's response was a contented sigh as she settled deeper into sleep, one tiny hand curled around my finger. She would never know her father, but she would know his love through the security he'd fought to provide and the strength he'd given me to see that fight through to the end. Marcus had tried to destroy everything David had built, but he'd failed. Our daughter would grow up surrounded by the legacy of David's love, protected by the evidence of his courage, and strengthened by the knowledge that justice had prevailed. David Carter's final investigation had been completed, successfully. 6 months after Emma's birth, the formal sentencing hearing took place. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue suit that projected confidence and competence, the image of a woman who had survived everything Marcus had thrown at her and emerged stronger. Emma came with me to the courthouse, sleeping peacefully in her carrier as we walked through the media gauntlet. At 6 months old, she was thriving, healthy, alert, and already showing signs of David's stubborn determination in the way she gripped her toys and refused to let go. The courtroom was packed with people whose lives had been touched by Marcus's crimes. Tom Rodriguez sat in the front row with several other employees who'd lost their jobs when Marcus's theft had disrupted ongoing projects. Representatives from the families of Richard Kowalski and James Freeman had flown in to witness Marcus finally being held accountable for his pattern of destruction. Judge Rebecca Martinez, no relation to my obstetrician, had a reputation for being tough but fair. She'd reviewed all the evidence, including the private investigator's report about Marcus's previous victims, and her expression was stern as she prepared to deliver the sentence. Marcus sat at the defendant's table looking defeated. The confident, charming man who'd delivered David's eulogy was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to have aged a decade in the past year. His attorney, Richard Camden, had abandoned the aggressive tactics from the deposition, recognizing that his client's situation was hopeless. "Mr. Hoffman," Judge Martinez began, "you have pled guilty to charges of embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and assault with a deadly weapon. Before I pronounce sentence, I want to address the scope and impact of your crimes." The judge spent 10 minutes detailing Marcus's systematic theft, his betrayal of trust, and the devastating impact on multiple families. She specifically mentioned David's death, noting that while Marcus hadn't been charged with murder, the stress of discovering the embezzlement had likely contributed to David's fatal heart attack. "Your crimes weren't crimes of passion or desperation," Judge Martinez continued. "They were calculated, premeditated acts carried out over months and years. You targeted vulnerable businesses and families, stealing not just money but security, trust, and peace of mind. When it came time for victim impact statements, I stood at the podium with Emma in my arms. The courtroom was silent as I began to speak. Your Honor, Marcus Hoffman didn't just steal money from my family. He stole my husband's peace of mind in his final weeks of life. He stole my sense of safety and security during my pregnancy. He attempted to steal my daughter's future and even tried to steal my life through poisoning." I looked directly at Marcus as I continued. But what he couldn't steal was the truth. He couldn't steal the evidence David gathered, the courage of witnesses who came forward, or the love that sustains our family. Justice has prevailed because good people refuse to let his crimes go unpunished. Emma chose that moment to wake up and look around the courtroom with wide, curious eyes. Several jurors smiled, and I could see Judge Martinez's expression soften slightly. This little girl will never know her father, but she'd grow up knowing that he died protecting her future. She know that justice exists, and that people who harm families like ours will be held accountable. When I returned to my seat, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Marcus's attorney made a brief plea for leniency, arguing that his client had suffered enough and expressing regret for the crimes. But when Judge Martinez asked Marcus if he wanted to make a statement, he declined, staring at the floor in silence. "Mr. Hoffman," Judge Martinez said as she prepared to pronounce sentence, "the court sentences you to 8 years in state prison for embezzlement and fraud, 2 years for forgery to run concurrently, and an additional 3 years for assault with a deadly weapon, for a total of 11 years. You will serve a minimum of 7 years before being eligible for parole. Additionally, you are ordered to pay full restitution of $1,247,000 to the Carter family, plus court costs and attorney fees. A civil judgment will be entered to ensure that any future assets you acquire will be subject to collection until this debt is fully satisfied." The gavel came down with finality, and Marcus was led away in handcuffs. As he passed our row, he glanced at Emma and me, but there was no remorse in his eyes, only the hollow stare of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Outside the courthouse, Sarah fielded questions from reporters while I held Emma and reflected on the long journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a grieving widow who discovered that her husband's best friend was stealing from her family. Today I was a survivor who'd seen justice done and secured her daughter's future. "How does it feel to see Marcus sentenced?" one reporter asked. "It feels like closure," I said honestly. "Not because I wanted revenge, but because the truth has been acknowledged and David's reputation has been restored. My daughter will grow up knowing that her father was a hero who died fighting for his family. What's next for you and Emma?" I looked down at my daughter, who was contentedly chewing on her fingers and watching the bustling activity around us. "We're going to build a life worthy of David's sacrifice. Emma will have opportunities he dreamed of giving her, and she'll learn about integrity, courage, and the importance of fighting for what's right. As we drove home from the courthouse, I felt a profound sense of completion. The legal battle was over, justice had been served, and Emma's future was secure. David's final investigation had succeeded beyond what he could have imagined. Not only had Marcus been stopped, but his entire pattern of victimizing families had been exposed and ended. That evening, I updated the trust fund documents that would ensure Emma's college education and provide her with financial security for life. The money Marcus had stolen and been forced to return would give our daughter advantages that David and I had never dreamed possible. But more importantly, Emma would inherit something far more valuable than money: the knowledge that her parents had been people of integrity who'd fought for truth and justice, even when the cost was high. Marcus Hoffman was behind bars, his crimes exposed, his victims vindicated. David Carter's legacy was secure, and his daughter's future was bright. Justice had been served, and our family could finally heal. 1 year after Marcus's sentencing, I stood in the office of Carter Construction, the rebuilt version of the company David had founded. Emma, now 18 months old, was toddling around the conference room, babbling happily as she examined everything within her reach. The decision to rebuild the business hadn't been easy. After everything that had happened, I'd considered selling the remaining assets and starting fresh in a completely different field. But as Emma had grown and begun to show David's curious nature and determined personality, I'd realized that preserving his legacy was important for both of us. Tom Rodriguez had agreed to serve as the general manager, bringing his 20 years of construction experience and his unshakable integrity to the leadership role. We'd hired back most of the employees who'd been laid off during the legal battles, and we'd established new financial controls to ensure that what happened with Marcus could never happen again. "Mrs. Carter," Tom said, reviewing the quarterly reports, "I think David would be proud of what we've built here. We're profitable, our reputation in the community has been restored, and we're booked solid through next spring." The rebuilt Carter Construction was smaller than the original company, but more sustainable. We focused on residential projects and small commercial jobs, building relationships with clients based on the honesty and craftsmanship that had always been David's trademark. But the business was only part of my new life. I'd also established the David Carter Foundation, a non-profit organization that provided financial literacy education and fraud prevention resources to small business owners. The foundation was funded by a portion of the restitution money Marcus had been forced to pay, and it had already helped dozens of families recognize and prevent embezzlement. Every month, we get calls from business owners who've noticed suspicious financial activity. I told the local newspaper when they interviewed me about the foundation's first anniversary. David's investigation techniques have become a template for other families facing similar situations. The foundation had also connected with the families of Marcus's previous victims. Richard Kowalski's widow had recovered some of her stolen assets using the evidence our private investigator had gathered, and James Freeman's children had gained closure by learning the truth about their father's death. But perhaps the most meaningful part of my new life was the unexpected relationships that had developed. Dr. Sarah Patterson had become not just my attorney, but a close friend, often joining Emma and me for dinner and serving as a kind of surrogate aunt. Tom Rodriguez's wife, Maria, had become my closest confidant, helping me navigate the challenges of single motherhood while running a business. Most surprisingly, I'd found love again. Detective Michelle Torres, who'd led the investigation into Marcus's crimes, had stayed in touch after the case closed. What had started as professional friendship had gradually deepened into something more personal. "I never expected to care about someone so soon after David," I confided to Maria one evening as we watched Emma play in the backyard. "It feels like I'm betraying his memory. Megan, David loved you enough to die protecting your future. Don't you think he'd want that future to include happiness and love?" Michelle understood the complexities of my situation in ways that few people could. She'd seen the evidence of David's love and sacrifice. She'd witnessed the strength it had taken to survive Marcus's attacks. And she respected the fact that Emma and I would always carry David's memory with us. When Michelle proposed 6 months later, it was in David's workshop with Emma playing nearby and his picture watching over us. "I'm not trying to replace David," she said simply. "I just want to build a future with the remarkable woman he loved and the amazing daughter he died protecting." The wedding was small and simple, held in our backyard with Emma serving as the world's most enthusiastic flower girl. As I looked around at the faces of our friends Tom and Maria, Sarah Patterson, Detective Torres's colleagues who'd become extended family, I realized that David's sacrifice had created something beautiful. He died to protect Emma and me, but his death had also brought together a community of people committed to justice, integrity, and supporting each other through life's challenges. That evening, as I tucked Emma into her crib, I told her the bedtime story I shared with her every night. The story of her brave father who'd loved her so much that he'd fought to protect her future even before she was born. "Daddy can't be here with us," I whispered, "but he made sure we'd have everything we need to be happy and safe. And now we have Michelle too, who loves us both and wants to help us honor Daddy's memory." Emma's response was a sleepy smile and a contented sigh as she drifted off to sleep, her tiny hand curled around the small wooden horse David had carved for her before she was born. Looking around Emma's room, the nursery David had never seen completed, filled with toys he'd never watched her play with, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Marcus had tried to destroy our family, but instead, his crimes had revealed the strength of the community that surrounded us. David's love had created a foundation strong enough to support not just Emma and me, but everyone who'd been touched by his integrity and sacrifice. We'd not only survived Marcus's betrayal, we built something better and stronger in its place. The future David had dreamed of giving his daughter was secure, but it was even richer than he could have imagined. Emma would grow up surrounded by people who'd known her father's courage and would help her understand the legacy of love he'd left behind. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I paused to look at the family photo on Emma's dresser. David, holding the ultrasound image, his face glowing with excitement about becoming a father. Beside it was a newer photo of Emma, Michelle, and me, all of us smiling as we celebrated Emma's first birthday. 2 pictures, representing the love that had brought Emma into the world and the love that would guide her through it. David's sacrifice had made both possible, and for that, I would be grateful for the rest of my life. On Emma's 2nd birthday, we held a celebration that David would have loved. The backyard was filled with the children of our employees and friends, their laughter echoing through the space where David used to work on his weekend projects. Emma, now a confident toddler with David's dark hair and determined chin, commanded the festivities with the natural authority of someone who'd never doubted she was loved. Daughter's ease. I watched her carefully blow out the candles on her birthday cake. I thought about all the moments David had missed and all the moments yet to come. Emma would start preschool next year. She'd learn to read. She'd ask questions about her father that I'd answer with joy rather than sadness. "Mama, where Daddy?" Emma asked, as she often did when looking at his pictures. "Daddy's in heaven, sweetheart. But he's always watching over us. And he made sure you'd have everything you need to grow up happy and strong." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her 2-year-old mind, then immediately returned to the important business of eating cake with her hands. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and Emma was asleep, Michelle and I sat on the front porch reviewing the trust fund statements that had arrived that morning. The restitution money Marcus had been forced to pay, combined with careful investment and the profits from the rebuilt construction company, had grown into a substantial college fund for Emma. "David would be amazed," Michelle said, reviewing the financial projections. "Emma will be able to attend any college she chooses, graduate debt-free, and still have money left over to start her own business or buy her first home." But the monetary inheritance was only part of Emma's legacy. The David Carter Foundation had become a nationally recognized resource for small business fraud prevention, helping hundreds of families protect themselves from predators like Marcus. Emma would grow up knowing that her father's sacrifice had prevented other children from losing their security the way she'd lost hers. Most importantly, Emma was surrounded by people who'd known David and could share their memories of his character, his craftsmanship, and his love for his family. Tom Rodriguez had become like a grandfather to her, teaching her about tools and building, just as David would have done. Sarah Patterson had established a tradition of taking Emma to the zoo every month, creating new memories while honoring David's love of animals. Even the legal victory had continued to pay dividends beyond our family. Marcus's conviction had led to investigations of other construction industry fraud cases, and 2 more serial embezzlers had been caught using the patterns James Mitchell had identified. The precedent set by our case had made it easier for other victims to seek justice. "I got a call from Detective Torres in Sacramento today," Michelle said, referring to her former colleague who'd moved to California. "They're using David's investigation techniques to prosecute an embezzlement case there." A business owner's widow found similar evidence hidden in her husband's office after he died of a suspicious heart attack. The ripple effects of David's courage continued to spread, protecting families we'd never meet from criminals we'd never face. His final investigation had become a template for justice that would outlive all of us. As Emma grew older, I planned to tell her the complete story of what her father had done, not just the fact that he'd died protecting us, but the specific ways his integrity and determination had created the security she enjoyed. I wanted her to understand that heroes weren't just characters in storybooks, but real people who chose to do the right thing even when it was difficult or dangerous. "When she's old enough to understand," I told Michelle, "I want her to read David's journal entries and watch his video testimony. I want her to see how he balanced his love for us with his commitment to justice. She'd be proud of him," Michelle said with certainty, "and she understand that strength and integrity are her true inheritance." 3 years had passed since that devastating phone call when I'd learned about David's heart attack. In that time, Emma and I had survived betrayal, fought for justice, rebuilt our lives, and found new love. We transformed from victims into survivors, from a broken family into a thriving one. But the most important transformation had been internal. I discovered a strength I'd never known I possessed: the strength to stand up to intimidation, to seek truth in the face of lies, and to protect my daughter's future, no matter what obstacles stood in my way. David had died believing that I was strong enough to finish what he'd started. He'd been right, but I'd become even stronger than either of us had imagined possible. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, she asked her usual question: "Tell me about Daddy?" "Your daddy was the bravest man I ever knew," I began, settling into the rocking chair beside her crib. "He built beautiful houses for families he loved, used more than anything in the world, and he made sure we'd always be safe and happy." "Daddy loved Emma?" "Daddy loved Emma so much that he made sure she'd have everything she needed, even though he couldn't stay with us. He loved you before you were even born, and that love is still protecting you every single day." Emma's eyes drifted closed, but she whispered one more question. "Emma loved Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart. Emma loves Daddy, and Daddy loves Emma. And that love will last forever." As I watched my daughter sleep, surrounded by the security David had died to provide, I felt a profound sense of completion. Marcus had tried to steal our future, but instead, he'd revealed the depth of David's love and the strength of our family's bond. Emma would grow up knowing that she was cherished, protected, and empowered to make a difference in the world. She'd learned David's values of honesty, hard work, and standing up for what's right. And someday, when she was ready, she'd understand that her father's greatest construction project hadn't been any of the buildings he'd created. It had been the foundation of love and security he'd built for her future. David Carter's legacy lived on in every laugh Emma shared, every question she asked, every moment of joy she experienced. Marcus Hoffman had stolen money, but he'd never touched what truly mattered: the love that connected our family across time and death. That love would guide Emma through whatever challenges life brought, just as it had guided me through the darkest period of my life. David's final gift to his daughter wasn't just financial security, it was the knowledge that she was worthy of fighting for, that justice was possible, and that love could triumph over even the deepest betrayal. Emma Grace. Carter would grow up knowing she was her father's greatest achievement, and that knowledge would make her unstoppable.